You're like,
This is Senate Transportation, and we're here with the secretary. If you could introduce yourself, and we thought our first kind of full week of testimony, we ought to start with the top dog over here.
Thank you very much, Chair Westman. For the record, Joe Flynn, Secretary of the Agency of Transportation. With me in the room today, Michelle Boomhauer, the Director of Policy Planning and Intermodal Development. Jana Morse, the Director of Finance and Administration. Jeremy Reed, the Chief Engineer of the agency. Andrew Collier, the Commissioner of the Department of Motor Vehicles. Ernie Patno, the Director of District Maintenance, and Todd Law, the Director of District Fleet. And I believe that's everybody that I can see. So we appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think at this point, I didn't have any formal presentation to go through.
We actually weren't looking for
Right,
that.
right.
We wanted to, and we know that all of the rest of them will be showing up in their capacity to do budgets, and we'll at that point want them to each introduce themselves.
Perfect.
and work through that. When you had like the member here from your county,
Yes,
I served with him for 5 years, and then he stayed another 9 after 14 years. I think he has a little view of the world, but we wanted to get you in here.
yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess if you're just looking for a quick overview, and then I appreciate questions, really the best way to dialogue. But obviously our budget will come out on the 28th, and there'll be a lot more to talk about with you then. But I think the thing I would say to you today is that the mission of the agency is, as you would expect, we are continuing to be focused on infrastructure condition. We certainly have met challenges with respect to pricing in the last few years. I would say that the Infrastructure and Investment Act that came under the last reauthorization that sent an additional $572 million to Vermont through the reauthorization, which bumped our allocation up from 1.2 billion to 1.7 billion. That was understandably helpful, but given what inflation did and given what the cost of materials did, it was a godsend, if you will, because had we not had that extra money, we may have maybe not quite backwards, but we may have backslid somewhat with our ability just to maintain the status quo. I would say that we're also in the early throes of hearing Congress talk about reauthorization. This has nothing to do with an administration change. Reauthorization occurs every 5 years, and regardless of who the administration is. And so there's already discussions about in Congress, what will FAST Act is what it's called. What will it look like at the next reauthorization? Federal Aviation Administration has already done its reauthorization, and that actually has gone back to pre-2JA numbers, not perhaps to the exact pre-2JA number, but it is not at what it was during 2JA. I'm not sure it's worth too much effort to read the tea leaves at this point, because we're still in 2JA right now for this budget and the next budget. But we're all going to be patiently waiting to see what comes. In addition to 2JA, this current reauthorization provided 20 new competitive grants as well. Total of 26, but six of those grants were grants we already were pinging. The 20 new competitive grants nationwide, some of which we have applied for. We don't know whether or not there will be that additional suite of opportunity as well. So the landscape will change for sure. The degree to which it changes is unknown. And again, I want to emphasize that has nothing to do necessarily with an administration change. It is the workings of Congress. And in our case, it's an interesting animal. Unlike some of the budgets that Congress deals with, DOD and others, it's not an annual budget in our case. So we know what we're going to get for 5 years. And that money does come to us. So Labor pressures, you may know, we're authorized for 1,300 people. We currently have, I believe it's about 110 vacancies. Not every one of those is dormant. And by that, I mean, many vacancies are in the hiring process. There are either interviews underway or background checks that are being conducted. But we clearly do have, more vacancies than we'd like. Everyone knows that the labor market is very tough these days. CDL drivers are an area that we are hurting in, frankly, especially in the Northwest. The wages in the Northwest are the most competitive in Vermont. The cost of living in the Northwest is the highest, at least as a region. And so it's difficult for us to hire up there. Civil engineering is an area that we also are experiencing a bit of a drought, if you will, in the pool of candidates that we might otherwise see. And that's a somewhat new reality for us. And I think that it's a case that many departments of transportation around the nation are also seeing. Other areas, let's see, Department of Motor Vehicles, as you'll hear more of, is undergoing a tremendous transformation in technology. And that is due to conclude, or I should say that the benefits that'll begin when the transformation concludes in November of this year. You'll hear much more about that. We call it the core system upgrade, not to be confused with what I said a moment ago about federal highway funding, but FAST is the name of the company we've partnered with. Nothing to do with the FAST Act. FAST has worked for tax in Vermont as well. But it'll truly transform a Vermonter's experience, and quite frankly, more beneficial. It's going to transform the back end experience across the street and at the branches around Vermont. The muscle movements, if you will, the reduction in time something is handled by a person, which obviously amplify the opportunity for human error. So that's a tremendous program, and obviously you all were here in the legislature when it as a body agreed to that expenditure of $48 to $50 million. And, DMV has delivered the first portion of that in November of 2023. And I'm proud to say on time, on budget, which is not always easy to say.
Not been,
right.
Vermont is not famous for doing that.
And I'll obviously have to mention ADS too, because, no one does these things alone, but for them and their leadership in that whole technology space and the knowledge and skills of the DMV employees that are communicating what we need to do. And this company FAST, which you'll hear more of a report on, but this company FAST has moved, 30 families probably into Vermont. And they've been here for almost 3 years now. I mean, about houses, some of them have had children, and they come in and there will be a bit of a legacy of those people over time as well. So it's a tremendous program. Other areas, aviation, you may be aware, certainly Senator Harrison was at the last aviation advisory council meeting. We've made a change, and we now have a singular director of aviation, Evan Robinson. Evan has been with the former Rail and Aviation Bureau for 6.5 years. Evan came to us and started our drone program, our UAS program. The rail side has grown so much, and you'll hear more from Dan Delavriere. He's still with us. Trini Bassard is still with us. But I'd like to point just to last year as an example. I get a weekly, as you probably know, and the construction division and the highway division is always putting project information in. And we all see most of these highway projects, depending on where we live and where we travel. Rail projects are often off in the pucker bucket, and you don't see them. You just don't see them because of where the railroads are. There were 14 major bridge projects last year. Now, by that, I mean where the railroad suspended operation, which is a complex thing to get them to do, and an old culvert gets replaced with box culverts, modern, large box culverts that take the same consideration as a highway project, aquatic organism passage, greater water flow passage, increased rainfall. 14 of these projects, and it reflected millions of dollars. And I believe, and I still do, that we were at a point for a lot of reasons why primary singular focus was necessary. And for the record, I want to just say the tremendous job Dan Delabriere did as the director of rail and aviation. On the aviation side, he brought infrastructure development to those airports. And I purposefully say he did those projects the right way. Full compliance with FAA. And now he's singular focus on rail, certainly collaborating. We all collaborate. So that's a bit of a nuanced difference that you'll see further testimony on. I'm trying to think of other areas. Central Garage. As you know, Central Garage was devastated in 2023. It flooded again in 2024. I have video from 2023 standing in the same place at about the same time on the same day, which was 2 a.m. on the morning of July 11th, 2023. And I was at the same spot at 2 a.m. on July 11th, 2024, which was in the parking lot of the former Volkswagen dealership at the base of Hospital Hill. And it isn't just the Stevens Branch out back, which raised and flooded. It's Pond Brook, which comes down from Payne Turnpike, comes down past the hospital. It was a torrent of water cascading across Route 302. Dumpsters floating like they were fishing bobs, and 3 to 4 feet of water in our buildings, electrical systems, heating systems. Our staff was able to move millions of dollars worth of equipment. There was some equipment they couldn't move. There were some trucks on jacks in the main maintenance facility. Some vehicles may not have had a transmission, or the engine might have been torn down. We lost a couple of sedans. But that loss was minimized because of the hustle. And we had to do that again in December of 2023. We had to do it again in July of 2024. And for the record, some have heard us say this, but for everyone, and some members are new to the committee, we've made the formal decision. We're not going to stay on Route 302. We do have a footprint there today in a back building, just as we need somewhere to maintain the fleet of $75 million value that we have, thanks to the taxpayers of Vermont. We purchased property on Payne Turnpike. Senator Perchlik was on the committee last year when that was discussed. We purchased 21 acres, 23 acres. It's adjacent to where the state police renovated the former libraries building, right by the intersection by the Berlin Fire Station. We have a green light on a FEMA fund to start the process of scoping and design and engineering for that building. The building we have permits for. The property came with a permitted building area on it, which will facilitate the building size that we need. We're working with ANR on consideration for some wetland buffers in a small piece of the Class 2 wetland so that we could enlarge the remaining area if possible. But we're moving forward with the construction of the building itself that we have to do. The building would have, and we'll show you pictures and whatnot, but the building will be, if you picture sort of a small plus sign, the longest ends total, you're looking at 400 feet by 100 feet. There'll be, on each wing, there'll be 4 16-foot doors on both sides. So there'll be 8 bays and then 8 bays. And inside, each truck would have 25 feet of space, including the truck, to work around, with an aisle in the middle for the movement of parts and anything. And then the center of this plus sign, if you will, would be the parts department, which will service both bays. We've spent a fair amount of time. Todd is the project manager. Todd ran to New Hampshire, visited with the city of Manchester, I think, also visited with New Hampshire DOT. We all went and visited with Carlo Boyce in Colchester, Vermont, who built a facility about 15, 16 years ago, to ask them what do they like about what they built, what would they do different if they were to do it again. We went to Caterpillar, Milton, and Richmond. We asked them, they showed us their maintenance facility. What do you like about what you did? What would you do different? I think we've done some real due diligence. Plus, we talked a lot with our employees, which is really the most important thing. about, you know, what do you see the needs? And the thing I'd like to emphasize on that, I could talk about this thing all day, but the thing I'd like to emphasize on this building is we're building a structure, frankly, which I expect it'll be here in 75 to 100 years. So we need to build a structure, not just to accommodate what we need today, but we need to be forward thinking enough to imagine, if you will, what might some expected requirements be in the future. So that at some point, someone in the future sitting here talking to some other committee in the future doesn't opine that, but if we'd only done this, you know, yeah, we can't foresee everything, but like our District 8 facility, we will build this facility. The intention is to build what I would call a green facility. District 8, we have no fossil fuels to operate that facility. We'll get further into the design and architecture, which we will share as we do for Central Garage. But it gives us a chance here to do something that will last a long time. But to put it in perspective, the building we've been working in is 69 years old, and it wasn't even built for that purpose. So it's conceivable that this thing will last a long time. That's a big deal for us. So, I mean, I think really at this point, I mean, I could ramble, a lot of good projects happening, but I probably prefer, Chair, to just have our team and myself field your questions.
I think the vice chair is eager to ask questions. She's got her hand.
I know, like, I don't even know, but, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a lot of questions, but I'm only gonna limit myself to two because I feel like that, I don't wanna take over the dialogue. We have declining gas tax revenues that are going to impact our ability to maintain roads, bridges, anything transportation related. And there has not been a proposal from the administration or from AOT on how to resolve the incoming and continuing to decline revenue shortfall that we can clearly predict. I'm wondering if you have reflections or thoughts on if a proposal is coming or what you see as the main area you would cut costs to reflect this reduction.
Cutting costs will be difficult, and I don't want to suggest that there's never an opportunity to look at operations, but we can't really cut construction, we can't cut maintenance, and what you're left with is operation expenses, which are tough. In part because we have a contract we have to meet every year, and there's other things we could look at. But to your point, the legislature did approve of a plan which goes into effect, I think, July 1st. Or did it go into effect January 1st? I'm looking at Michelle.
January 1st.
January. Yeah. So there is currently a plan right now. It's in force where people with EVs are paying a fee right now.
Yep, I paid it, registered.
Right. So the administration did put that forth, and it was supported by the legislature. And the administration has put forth the mileage-based user fee, which has also been supported by the legislature. So that was an administration suggestion. And that is coming together. The mileage-based user fee will be discussed further at this session, I believe, and one of the goals will be to determine when does that formally go into effect. There's some debate among the community that it ought to wait till X number of EVs are registered. It's the administration's position at this time. Once we agree on that mileage-based user fee, it ought to go into effect right off, not wait until there's, say, 30,000 cars or something like that. There's about 17,000 now EVs in Vermont. And that will be a function basically of, as I understand it, an annual look back on the miles driven at the inspection process. And there'll be a fee based on that. So that was an administration proposal. And so I would offer that we are doing something about that. And you're absolutely right to raise the question, though, about the impacts that EVs have on revenue streams. But we're addressing that. And I think the other thing, too, that we've said right along is eventually I think you're going to see the federal government with some additional involvement there, because the federal government is currently involved in the gas and diesel tax.
Yes.
And then the state adds to that. The federal government, that's part of how they fund, when I talked about FAST and reauthorization. Nationally, they're going to see the same thing occurring we're seeing in Vermont. And we would expect that nationally, eventually, the federal government is going to have to re-examine its current makeup of revenue and migrate somehow away from being wholly dependent upon gas and diesel taxes because of the declining use, as you said. So, so in addition to what we're attempting to do now, that's the short-term answer to the question.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying federal government's gonna step in and increase the gas tax, and that's kind of the long-term vision. And then mileage-based user fee for all vehicles is the direction that the administration sees for recuperating that loss over time.
The second portion, yes, we all would expect at some point the federal government to take some action, but I don't want to go on the record of saying the federal government is going to step in.
Okay,
But at the national level, DOTs across the country are having this conversation with the federal government.
Okay.
So it's on the radar of them. National organizations like AASHTO, which is the national group that we all are represented by. But in the short term, Vermont has an answer to the question, but I wouldn't say that it's a whole solution.
okay, that's so helpful to hear, honestly, because I think what I'm hearing from my constituents is not necessarily concerned that like more EVs are coming on, the gas tax is going down, but that like there's hybrid vehicles, there's light duty trucks that's driving it. And whether or not we hit our carbon goals or carbon reduction goals, we're still seeing cars get more efficient and use less gas. So I really appreciate that. And then my second question, because I'm limiting myself, is that we have had an influx nationally of traffic deaths, particularly pedestrian and non-vehicle, someone on a bike, someone in a crosswalk, being killed or being injured. And I know that that's a really big focus of the agency, is making sure that pedestrians and vehicle commuting traffic are safe. And it's actually, I think, a big bright spot for Vermont. But we have had a very tragic recent death of someone on our roads who was biking. And I'm wondering if you could speak to your philosophy around that and how we see making sure that Vermonters are safe on our roads, regardless of how they're commuting on those roads. And if you want to speak to some of the work that you do.
Yeah, I don't want to spend much time on that particular crash, but I am aware of it. I believe it was also like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I don't know, what the individual was wearing for clothing, but clearly they were struck and killed, and that's tragedy. A woman from my town who our kids knew, who grew up, was killed in Rutland a year ago crossing the road. There are often circumstances beyond that fact, but that's not what we're here to discuss. As far as fatalities overall, we did see, and we couldn't have made this with a smaller font. And I don't want to get out my magnifying my phone and look like
Don't save your money there. Just
Right.
I'm reading the same boat as you.
yeah. So, there's an ebb and a flow, if you will, to pedestrian crashes every year. But I'd like to point out that overall fatalities are down in 2024 at a rate that's recognizably lower than 2023. But my point on that is it's never good enough. All right. I don't want to celebrate the fact that only 50 people were killed last year. That's not what I'm saying. But I want to point out that that's a reduction from the prior year. And I want to point out another thing, that seatbelt involvement in those crashes, well, sadly, is still 1 out of every 2 of those people killed chose not to wear a seatbelt. Whether or not that would have saved them, we can't say, but we can say that half of them were not belted. But that percentage is a lower number than prior years also. So we have to recognize, at least we have to recognize that. The other thing I would add, which I know, and I'm not trying to filibuster your question,
No,
is on the topic here. The percentage of people who use seatbelts in Vermont is at a number that's about 88%. It's about the highest it's been. And there's been an immense effort through the years on education and enforcement, but primarily education. And so we are seeing seatbelt use rates in Vermont that are close or equal to some states that have seatbelt as a primary stop.
Oh, okay.
Which is good news. A couple of other points on the fatalities I would point out. The involvement of alcohol only in deaths, in fatal crashes, is down pretty significantly in 24 over 23. the involvement of drugs only in fatal crashes is down as a percentage in 24 over 23. But the involvement of drugs and alcohol in fatal crashes is almost double in 24 from what it was in 23. I don't pretend to draw some sort of a social outcome based on that statement, but it's a statement, and the data often leads us to conclusions and actions which we haven't arrived at yet. And the other thing I want to say for the record is the statistics that I'm citing at this moment are not all confirmed, and the reason is because I don't know this, but there could be people that are still in the hospital from a crash in November or December. And if they were to succumb, those stats change. And the other thing here that we have to wait until probably into early February is not all the toxicology is in on every crash, especially say in late December. So the stats that I just talked about between alcohol and drugs would change. But the data that I just gave you is as of early November. So as far as pedestrian, you will hear in bicycles, we have a group that does nothing but focus on bike and ped projects and bike and ped safety. We will be in and we will talk about that. We lean money toward that in our budget. Our projects today, as far as our major paving projects, try to take into account, I hate the word vulnerable users because it's sort of, all users, but pedestrians and bicyclists, if you will, on our paving projects where possible. If you take Route 2 from here to Waterbury now, there's more room along the white line than there used to be. Is it ideal? Is it a 12-foot shared use space? It isn't, but that's not possible every place. But it's an example of what we try to do. And you'll find those all over Vermont where we can do that. So I think that the other thing in the case of Shelburne Road, that crash you referenced, I believe, occurred on Dorset Street.
Yeah.
But Shelburne Road, the highway division could cite this statistic when they come in, but I believe what it was we've heard from municipalities there are, I want to say 14% fewer crashes. I don't want to stretch that to think it's 40, but 14% fewer crashes along that stretch of Route 7 at Shelburne Road, where we just completed a major intersection signaling project, multiple signals. So can't say that the signals themselves have resulted in that, but if the reverse were true, we'd be targeted for having a problem. So I think collectively, the municipalities had said to us that it seems as though that signal work you did may have had some outcomes, at least as far as reportable crashes. So, it's a never-ending conversation. And I think too that it's important that we work closely with, especially the bicycling community. We work with Locomotion, we fund the Locomotion. I think education on that front is important as well.
It's
Yeah, thank you.
beyond your control, and I think the agency's working on this. This is beyond your control, and it's maybe totally anecdotal on my part. It may be because I'm older, but boy, I think people are driving fast.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure public safety is enforcing in quite the same way, or they would have to answer that. But I think the public is driving faster.
I commute a lot as well, and I think overall that's true. It's unscientific that it's an observation.
Yeah, mine's anecdotal too,
Yeah.
but I see people go by me and it's like, oh.
No, it's not just the rate of speed, but it's the aggressive nature of so many vehicles today. Even if you're going 50 versus 70 or 80, which they shouldn't be, but it's just the aggressive nature. It's the passing on the interstate, passing on the right and moving back over. I will say though, my observation so far this winter, I've been pleasantly surprised and pleased at what I see as the manner of travelers, especially the last week. It blew every day. And the crews are out, but the interstate, when you have a 35, 40 mile an hour wind, it's 11 degrees, snow's blowing sideways, you got to constantly be out there. I mean, it was, you had to really drive appropriately for the speed, as you always should, but for the most part, I stop and I commute 60 miles a day each way on the interstate. And I, for the most part, saw behavior better than I've seen in a lot of years. Usually you see that four-wheel driver, that SUV upside down in the median who passed you 20 minutes before, just because they have four-wheel drive and somehow they think that's going to protect them on ice. But anyway, I think you're right. I think that certainly traffic behavior, again, is a topic that's discussed when we meet with Federal Highway Administration. And these are national topics. I think we all sort of saw what at least coincided with part of the pandemic, which I think was sort of this devil may care attitude among motorists. And I don't know what was behind it sociologically, but I don't know. I survived this global pandemic and, just going to throw caution to the wind when I get behind the car now, by the wheels.
It also seems like everyone has their phone out. So I know that we've discussed this committee, I think in previous years has had a distracted driving bill, and the agency has always been very open to those conversations, but certainly distracted driving is a key driver. And I know you stated the drugs and alcohol use, but if you have statistics on pullovers as it relates to having a phone out I felt a woman on an actual iPad the other day. I was like, how are you holding an iPad?
Well, I would think
But-
the pullovers, you would want to ask on public safety.
Okay, so
That's
that
not,
would be,
it's not the secretary's job to, public safety is not his.
I mean,
but DMV,
what
can
we
I
do,
ask a clarifying question on
Sure.
whose jurisdiction that is? So DMV enforcement, they don't keep stats on the distracted driving or?
although all law enforcement is required to provide the stats from their stops, all law enforcement. But I think to the chair's point, it would be troopers, it would be sheriffs, it would be municipal PDs, as well as DMV officers. If a warden stops somebody, that data is all pushed into a database that actually initially comes to the agency, and our group under the Operations and Safety Bureau will be in to testify.
Okay.
And then they create the fatality statistics that I just shared with you. They also create the crash data that has nothing to do with fatalities. But to the chair's point, I don't believe we capture traffic stops that just result in a civil violation ticket.
Okay.
That I think has to be queried through DPS and the Judicial Bureau where the tickets go. But your point is well made. Distracted driving is a big deal, but there's already a law against distracted driving. It's called the electronic device law. There's signs on the interstate. And so I think there's all sorts of opinions as to whether just increasing the fines or the points are going to change the behavior. And I couldn't offer an opinion because I guess my opinion is I'm not inclined to necessarily think it might stop the initial behavior, but it certainly is a bigger punishment if you get caught doing it. As far as the fatal crashes, that's a tough one because unless there's a second person in a vehicle or a third person, unless there's a survivor, there's very little way of knowing if a distraction caused it. They can subpoena a phone. And they could certainly look and see, was there activity on the phone at the time of the crash? But many times I would offer that a crash, whether it's fatal or not, is because somebody could have taken their eyes off the road for a second. We've all probably experienced that. I've been to many fatal crashes as a sheriff or a volunteer firefighter, and I've been to some fatalities, and that they were simply somebody looked down for something on the floor. Their dog was misbehaving. It didn't have anything to do with a device per se.
Or they're sleeping,
Well, there's that. Yeah. So traffic safety is a big one, and it's a national issue. Certainly.
Have other questions?
One more,
Okay,
one more.
okay,
And if anybody else in the committee wants,
okay,
because all of these.
we just never get a
and the
chance.
agency is gonna
I'll
come back.
come back
And
and
the secretary would come back anytime this committee wants it, I'm sure.
absolutely.
And, the secretary's generally around. Right.
It's nice to have on the record some of these perspectives though, because we'll hear from constituents who say, oh, the agency is against this, or oh, they're pro this. And I'm like, I actually don't know what the opinion is.
Right.
So it's helpful to hear, and I appreciate you willing to come speak to us. Municipalities are really struggling with the increase of climate related events that are washing out roads, getting rid of culverts, hurting bridges. I appreciate your head over there because he came to Reading and presented very cogently around some work you were doing in that town. But one of the crux issues is that our towns are not getting enough money to do their own road maintenance, in my opinion. I do not believe that the municipal funding formula is sufficient enough to meet the need. And so it's causing an increase on property taxes at the local level. And there's been this ongoing conversation about how 70% of our roads are maintained by municipalities, but the inverse is true of the funding that we get. And I'm wondering if you could speak to any changes or recommendations you would be offering as an administration to support our municipalities more with base funding, or if we are likely to see something like that, or are we just keeping on the same direction?
Right. As you know, I can't speak to specifics of the budget until it's released on the 28th.
Okay, fair.
I will tell you that in 2025, we invested $100 million out of our $876 million budget to Vermont municipalities. And that, you know, here's the thing, and you and I had this conversation. The only flexible money we have to work with is really state fund dollars. We can't take federal aviation money or federal transit money or federal rail money or even federal highway money. We obviously support local bridge projects with federal highway money, but we can't direct that money to operational expenses in a town. And any dollars that are redirected are taken, frankly, from the maintenance budget, because that is wholly funded by state dollars, the money that's raised from DMV, which we need to match the large investments the feds make. So any money that's redirected to upsize what goes to a town will have a correlating reduction in a maintenance function that the agency does somewhere in the state. That's just a fact. It's a push-pull relationship. It's not a failure to appreciate your point of view. You're right. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the road for a person in my job. And I go to a lot of towns, and I spent a lot of time. I walked into the Plainfield town clerk's office unannounced in July of 2024. They had a close sign. I banged on the door so I could see people, and ended up talking to Bram and the guy that runs the sewer department, water department, the person that ran the lady that was the assistant town clerk. They were in such a hard spot that right in that conversation, they didn't think they could make payroll. They were still waiting for FEMA money from 2023.
Yeah.
Now they got that FEMA money, but we connected them with Chief Recovery Officer Doug Farnham, who had some flex money. We saw the same thing in Kirby. Kirby's a small town. I don't think they have many. I don't even think they have any paved roads. Made up a little bit. It's mostly all gravel. I met with a select board member in Kirby, Ernie Shaw. We gave Kirby a trailer load of culverts. We just gave them to them. They were so just upside down, literally, with what was happening in Kirby. They didn't know what they were going to do. The town of Lindenville, between Red Village Road and Brook Road and Lindenville and others, they had to go to a bank and get an $8 million line of credit on the fact that eventually they'll be made whole by FEMA. So I hear you. I live in a small town, South Hero. At the end of the day, if people expect the state, through our budget, that the Agency of Transportation, or VTrans in particular, to push more money toward municipal government and municipal choices that aren't always just the result of climate change or natural disasters. Because in my town of South Hero, our road budget is close to $1 million. And I commend the job they do. But they also carry a fair amount of money every year. I used to be on the select board, so I know that. So all I'm saying is that I think there's a distinction between events that pressure budgets and ordinary routine municipal governance. And if communities are looking to the state to increase investments in the community, at least in the transportation space, it will come at a cost and a reduction in services the state otherwise is able to provide somewhere else. That's just a fact. It's not a dare. It's not. It's just a fact. We have a finite amount of money raised through Andrew's shop every year. And that money is available to us for all the federal money. And that's generally it. Now, the legislature has given us some general fund money at times, but our agency ordinarily is not funded by the general fund. We're not like any other agency that comes in and looks for, they present a budget that comes from general fund revenue. That's not what we do. We come in and present a budget that's funded by the federal government. And we show you how we're going to spend the money that's raised at DMV. So it's just a reality that's very complicated. And I'm not tone deaf at the pressures that towns are facing, but we provide assistance that's not recorded in the budget. We just loaned a truck that I've forgotten which town. I don't want to misspeak. Newark, Vermont called us. We gave them a truck. When Shalat had their building burned 3 years ago and everything in it, we gave them 3 V-Trans plow trucks for the entire winter. I mean, that's not captured in a budget. I mean, we're not that picky. We're not going to add that to say, look what we do. I mean, my point in sharing that is, I think we're responsible partners to communities. The problem you are rightfully citing is a bigger problem than a simple solution of just simply more money out of the transportation budget. And I don't know the answer to it, but I just contend that, well, it's a fact. When more money comes out of our budget directed to municipalities, it comes at the cost of something else in our budget. That's just a fact. There's a cause and effect relationship. It's not driven by policy. It would be the same under different administrations. I mean, I worked in this agency under the Douglas administration. So it's just, that's the way that, I hate to say the way it works, but that is a fact. It's a finite amount of money. And where we use it impacts it not going someplace else. Sorry, long-winded answer.
No, it's great.
But I like the conversation.
Other questions?
No, very interesting, and thank you for being here and
Thank you
forward
so
to
much.
more conversation.
This is a great group.
Do you want more?
I don't mean to dominate. You have everybody here. We're the experts.
And we will have them all back and they'll be in as they present their budgets, and we will ask them to introduce themselves as that.
Okay.
And we thank you for bringing everybody. And at this point, we are a little early, but we are on the schedule to have at least, I think it's you, Michelle, talk through lunch. So I
All right.
would like to give though, because I think Wendy and I are both going to be here. We're going to get sandwiches and sit down
There you go.
with Michelle for a half an hour at
All right.
lunch. But we do thank you for coming and appreciate the work that the whole agency's doing.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'd be happy to come back, but the people that
Oh, don't
Do you
worry,
get to this?
we're going to have you back. So.